face. Now, once you've healed the Avatar Sethrilus to full, he thanks you, he gives you a huge buff, and then you just have to deal with the rest of the trash in the dungeon.
The rest of the trash, and that shouldn't be too much danger either, because the players will have that well, essentially, actually, it is a debuff, but nonetheless, it buffs your character with 90% reduced damage taken, 50% haste, 50% healing. But, you know, with all the increased heart strike stacks that come from the Guardians at the end, plus any mismanagement with the bolster, even through that debuff, we've actually seen tanks get hit quite hard, so we'll have to manage that well at the end. Here comes the Tree of Life, though, as 40k's healer, Igloo, is getting ready to just pump as much as he can, conserving the mana simultaneously through the tree form, and just pump all of those regrowths into the Avatar Sethrilus to hit that 70% check mark as quickly as possible.
Even popping that Tranquility to get the boss up faster, applying that healing over time to the boss, instantly getting it to 70%, and once the boss gets to 70%, we start the second phase where they'll pretty much have to do the exact same thing. Kill all 4 Hoodoo Hexers, deal with one of the Heart Guardians, and also deal with those several Plague Doctor spawns that spawn throughout the phase.
Not the same thing, no way, Ironic. I don't believe it, but you are indeed right, never wrong here, as the Hoodoo Hexers get clipped over on the side. 3 are about to fall. Now, doing really well here. Now, we do have those Plague Toads that come in, and those will actually chase a player. Once they connect with the player, they will do an AoE explosion of nature damage, applying a dot of damage over time to you, plus a healing reduction of 50%. So you want somebody to run around grabbing those diseases, and then Lozelle will have the ability to dispel that off.
Right, and of course those Plague Frogs will fixate their threat targets, so typically what players will do is they'll spread out around the room and not stand close to their healer so they don't splash that AoE debuff, that healing debuff onto their healer, which of course is incredibly important in this fight because you have to heal the boss to get to the next phase.
That is correct, as Avatar Sethrilus finally is able to be healed again at 70%. We can see a well-timed orb proc there. Now, that orb falls from the Guardian that spawns the tank mob. Once you click that orb, it will bolster and supply some extra healing to the Avatar Sethrilus, allowing you to get through this transition phase just a bit faster. Not too far behind, though. Abrakeydabra find themselves in the second phase where 40k just finished up. They will have their Bloodlust become available to them a bit faster, but this time have still a 3-death differential, 15 seconds that they need to overcome as the final phase starts here for 40k. They're getting their buffs. You can see them on their character frames right now, and Igloo runs off right away to grab the remaining trash.
And once again, we've mentioned this many, many times. Pretty much once you have this buff, it's not a matter of are you going to die? It's how long is it going to take you to finish off the rest of this trash? This buff is massive. It's a damage buff, it's a haste buff, it's a damage taken buff. You don't take, it's impossible to die when you have this buff, so pretty much all they're doing is they're trying to efficiently AoE cleave everything down as much as possible. The only kind of nuance here is they want to try to make sure that they have one of those Hoodoo Hexers up at the end so they can keep this buff throughout the rest of the encounter, because once the boss is over, you lose that buff.
Yeah, you certainly don't want that. There's already 7 stacks of that Heart Strike on Rentari. We can see it. That's, if I'm not mistaken, 140% increased damage taken, as it's usually 20% per stack. 8 stacks now, so you can see how things can get pretty out of hand quickly, regardless of the 90% damage reduction on the tank. 9 stacks now, on top of if there's any mishandling of bolster, but it seems like that will not be the case here today, as the final Heart Guardians being pulled around with that last Plague Doctor. Team heads over to the final Hexer, and they will be finishing up the dungeon once again in a fairly commanding lead that they were on their way to doing in the first map. So the best team wins once again in terms of strat and performance here.
Very well-deserved victory here by 40k, taking Temple Sethrilus from Abrakeydabra here. And as Sours, you mentioned before, these are also the time trial dungeons that we had to be going through here. One that Abrakeydabra was #1 on. So the fact that 40k is taking it, they were more consistent, they were more clean on this one, really bodes well for the next matchup here in Motherlode.
Yeah, it was a really good mana throw from Abrakeydabra in this dungeon. They had a couple of mistakes that you really just can't have. The Elsarat death, it's plural, Elsarat deaths were not very good, so he ended up dying here on Galvast to the Quake. He's at just a low health, gets quaked, and they've got to reset the boss. He gets thrown out of the room, and this allows 40k to just pull ahead into a convincing lead. And they got a nice lead, and then Abrakeydabra threw them another bone just a second later, as a matter of fact, after the Eyeball Gauntlet, where Elsarat's doing his best to run through the orb. He gets quaked, he runs into the balls, and then he runs out, he runs into some more balls, and then, oh, he just gets to sit there and think about what he's done with a nice plate of fish next to him. That's an oof.
A very big oof indeed there, Sours. Thank you for that. And as we move on to Motherlode there, we have the Tyrannical teaming once again here, Sloot. Seen some of the teams moving throughout this entire dungeon, actually getting a little bit of trash percentage from everywhere here. What do you think about a lot of the teams have been pulling into the R&D wing?
Yeah, I mean, they have been. It's curious to see because in the first weeks for both East and West that we saw, most of them were just kind of dealing with 90-ish% of the trash before the first boss. And now we're seeing a shift towards, let's grab as many of the Peacekeepers as we can, deal with as minimal trash as we can, while still maintaining up to the 4th reaping, if I'm not mistaken, even 3rd reaping from some of the packs before they deal with the coin-operated crowd pummeler. And then they deal with a bunch of trash up to the 2nd boss. And, you know, maybe the R&D wing, Jack, like you're saying, you mention it, we all mention it all the time, it's super dangerous. We're all scared of it, but the couple times we've seen teams go into it, it really hasn't been that bad. They just kind of stomp through it and then skip the remaining half of the R&D wing and with their shadow meld from the Night Elves, and it's not been so bad. So perhaps a tendency to go in that direction now.
Yeah, we'll have to be seeing it on the other side of this break. But give us 1 minute, we'll be right back with Motherload between Abrakeydabra and 40K. K up 1-0 over Abrakeydabra as we move on to Game 2 in this time trial-oriented series here. I'm Jack, and joining me on the desk right now is Sours, Zyronic, and Sloot here. Moving on to the Motherload. We've seen a lot of teams going through this hours. We've seen a lot of Peacekeepers coming up into play. But overall, the Masterminds have proven to not be too difficult in that R&D wing to clear up just a little bit of the last bit of trash.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you don't really think about a lot in dungeons, is that running backwards is actually the worst possible thing that you can do. You should really just be trying to run forwards as much as possible.
Good advice.
You know, much faster to do that. So being able to just run through the first half more linearly and then do some of those mobs in the R&D ring is very efficient for just movement's sake.
And I think in many ways, since teaming will increase the amount of trash that you have to end up doing, people can start following most of their own route, and by the time that they get to Azerok, they're at 80-85% or something like that on teaming, but they're almost done when they're on when they're not on teaming. So at that point, they're just looking at, well, we got to keep on moving forward. Let's try to take out some of the things here. And even we've seen some of like the weapons testers, for example, is ironic, where they kind of match up pretty similarly to like the hired assassins, that if you have enough stuns, gouges, things like that to get the interrupts onto them, they're really not too much of a threat.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've talked about the research and development wing a lot here. It's one of those weird parts of the dungeon where I think a lot of people were instantly turned off by that section of the dungeon because of how much single target CC you needed to deal with all the trash, and because people were so used to the Legion style of just mass AoEing things down, and they didn't have that available. They're just like, you know what, we're not going to do that section of the dungeon anymore.
Well, let's dive right into it. Abrakeydabra needs this one to stay in the tournament here. 40K has been stepping up today. Let's see if they're going to be able to seal this one out on Motherload.
I'm going to be really curious here, Zyra, to see what, well, I mean, just how these pulls kind of muster up. A lot of the times we see teams even mass stealth past this beginning part into the HUD, especially at least during the explosive week, but not shying to it at all. Abrakeydabra just grabbing a mass pull here right in the middle. Leg sweep comes out. We can see the Peacekeeper formed on the side, but no bloodlust from either team yet as they get an equally sizable pull here. Charged claws coming up from the Peacekeepers. A lot of tank damage coming up.
Yeah, this is completely different from what we've seen from any other team, and we see Divine Field dropping incredibly low, 1% health on him there, but didn't even proc his Cheat Death Trinket if he has that equipped just yet, but he's still taking a massive amount of damage here.
Yeah, I mean, this is really dangerous. You can already see the sack pad coming out of Ashine. Now, both Unholy DKs have been busted out on the two sides. If you think about a trash-rich dungeon, and then on top of it, add teaming, the thing that first comes to your mind is the Motherload, and that is prime time for these Unholy DKs to shine with the amount of damage that they can output with burst AoE. So going to probably be seeing some big numbers coming out of the first reaping wave here as both teams stealth through and rear up to grab said pack. Now, well and accurately placed Ring of Peace there on purpose in order to make sure that the appropriate mech jockeys get to the non-active mechanized Peacekeepers on the side so that they can activate more of them.
Yeah, and definitely not surprised to see that Bloodlust pop for Team 40K, and probably eventually for Team Abrakeydabra here. This is the usual first pull that most teams do. They'll do this quad mechanized key Peacekeeper pull at the start of the dungeon with their Bloodlust, but we still have yet to see the Bloodlust pop from Abrakeydabra, so we'll have to see what they plan on doing with that later on in the dungeon. But these look like pretty similar trash pulls from them.
Similar. I think they only grabbed 3 Peacekeepers here, if I'm not mistaken, so perhaps just wasn't enough for them, but I mean, they don't want to delay it too long. They want to make sure that they get an appropriate amount of Bloodlust in throughout this dungeon. 40K, 3 seconds left on their Bloodlust, working to finish off these thugs right here as they will proc their first reaping wave. We'll see exactly what they choose to combine it with. Now, we've mentioned it before, teaming here means there's more trash present in the dungeon and more trash that you need to kill to reach your percentages. We do have that ever so dangerous Grievous affix too, so below 90% you will be accruing a higher and higher stacking dot up to 4 until you're healed back above 90%. But Zyra, let's talk about the trash here for a second. It's not really only for the tank that there's a lot of danger, but residual damage on the group in the form of the thugs, the grease gun coming out of the mech jockey, you have the ice spritzer going out as well.
Yeah, there's just so many mechanics to deal with. I think the most dangerous of all of those mechanics is going to be that Ice Spritzer cast from the refreshment vendors. It'll target a random player in the group, channel this Ice Spritzer ability on that player, doing in its own right a massive amount of damage, but should that channel finish, it'll freeze the person in place for about 5 seconds. Now this is dispellable, but you kind of need to save those dispels for your tank whenever reaping is procced.
A lot of poison damage on Divine Field as he drops to 1% health. He has procced his Somebody's Bargain Trinket. We can see that small absorb finally getting healed off there from Elsarat, but a lot of danger coming in for the Divine Field as just they still have a bunch more pulls to go before the next boss, so we won't have that available for 6 seconds, but those poison stacks come from Toxic Blade casts from the Assassin, so somebody failed to get an interrupt there, or they just did not have enough available, adding a ton of extra nature damage to their active target. 40K still dealing with their own pulls here as 2 Peacekeepers are grabbed on top of a smaller trash pack, getting ready to proc their 40% reaping wave.
Yeah, and I think something we kind of glossed over, I think I was droning on about research and development whenever it popped up on our screen. Both of these teams have opted to swap to the Unholy DK, which is not that surprising in this teaming dungeon affix, especially in this trash-rich Motherload dungeon. They both swapped to these Unholy DK just for their massive AoE damage potential. They're pulling so much trash. In addition to that, they're also pulling Reaping on top of even more trash just to take just to take full advantage of that Unholy Decay exponential AoE damage.
Yeah, we're going to see here in just a moment the 40% Reaping Wave actually on both sides as Abrakeydabra sits at 38 and Fourty just surpasses it. They get 44% on the board. Grab a couple of thugs, a lot of thugs, 3 thugs on the side. Got to be careful with their Inhale Vapors cast. It will increase their damage output by 50%. Not only dangerous for the tank here, but these are the mobs that charge off to one of the distant targets and do a fair bit of damage. So Igloo wary of that, getting not too far from the pack as they wait for their second Reaping Wave to join the pack. Abrakeydabra 43% on the board. Big pull coming out and leg sweep on top of those Risen Souls to try and control some of the stack gain on top of Divine Field.
And like we mentioned, that massive Unholy DK damage doing more than double anyone else in the group, probably doing about 50% of the overall damage of the group, which is pretty impressive just for 1 DPS, but that's that power of the Unholy DK. It's that massive AoE exponential damage once again. That's why they're pulling those ripping packs into more trash packs.
And just a bit of slop coming out of here from Abrakedabra's Dr. J as he gets clipped by one of the green swirlies that come out of the Lost Souls when they die. If you get hit by that, you will incur a 30-second debuff that decreases your healing and damage done by 10%. So not what you want to be having in a DPS race of trash pulling right now. Divine Field just having a lot of struggles getting out of that 4 stack of Grievous. Finally, Elsarat manages to heal him up, only to see him dip right back down below 90. Dr. J hovering in that 50% area as well, having his own troubles with the 4 stack of Grievous. A lot of issues coming out here just by avoidable damage and the group getting hit by said avoidable damage, making Elsarat's life just not very fun right now. Fourty moving in a more stable, let's say, manner over on the right side at 51% trash and triple Peacekeeper.
Yeah, in those situations where you see multiple people underneath that Grievous barrier, it kind of means you're not dealing with the trash. And the problem with this trash is that all of it requires so much CC, and you only have so much of it in your group, right? And the important thing to remember is only running one of those rogues, so they only have one character that can both interrupt and stun pretty occasionally. Their only other options are maybe a clutch grip from the DK or a ring of peace or leg sweep from the monk, so they don't have that much single target CC. So some of these abilities starting to leak through and do extra damage to some of the players in the group, that extra chip damage that you were mentioning.
Yeah, and even right there we saw one of the Flechette's Cat's Gift, its very first takeoff, and poison was applied to the group. That shouldn't be there in the first place because once again somebody did not interrupt the Toxic Blades on the Assassin. Now it could be a calculated lack of interrupt, they might just be divvying up their limited interrupts elsewhere, or somebody just may have easily missed it. Nonetheless, Abrakeydabra now has procced their third Reaping Wave at 66%, and Fourty follows suit with their third round of Reaping, pulling it amongst trash. Now, Zara, it seems that we're kind of seeing a more traditional route to Motherload so far, just dealing with as much of the trash in the first area as possible, expecting to see maybe the 80% Reaping Wave on top of the first boss.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at these routes, I think the only team that really kind of changed their route for this tournament has to be that Method E. When we go look at the time trial leaderboards, they were almost a full 2 minutes ahead of every other team, so it was clear that they knew something or had a different strat in this dungeon compared to everyone else. So it's not surprising to see them have a completely separate strategy from what the more traditional strategy is on the side of these teams. Abrakeydabra having almost a disaster scenario. These guys are still dropping down to poison incredibly quick. Dr. J proccing his cheat death. Ashine going down to that debuff, and that's one of those things we talked about. One of those hired assassins got their Toxic Blade debuff off. They didn't have a chance to interrupt it, and then he also got his Hail of Fletchettes cast off, which every single time that Hail of Fletchette does damage, it applies a stack of that Toxic Blade debuff to everyone in the group, and I believe they had 3 or 4 of those stacks of the debuff on everyone, and this is 2 deaths. It's probably going to be 3. It can keep going. It's going to be a full team wipe.
Oh, the irony of it all. I mean, we just talked about that. They didn't interrupt Toxic Blades. Flechette's was not interrupted. 4 stacks of poison damage over time on everybody, ramping into Grievous. 4 stacks of Grievous, way too much to heal, and that is going to be all she wrote for now for Abrakeydabra, as they have a full team wipe, need to recover, get right back into it. Dr. J has pulled something somewhere as he drops a significant amount of HP down and re-procs that cheat death. Might be trying to keep the pull alive in the corner, but we can see Jade now finally getting healed by Elsarat. But let's focus here on Fourty, who has procced their 4th Reaping Wave perfectly at 81%, moving over into, I believe we'll be moving into crowd operated Pummeler's room. Yes, so they're going to pull the first boss with that Reaping Wave coming in. Actually, I don't even know if they're going to do the Reaping Wave. It looks like they just kind of shadow melded it off.
It looked like they were bringing peace just to give themselves a little bit of extra time to shadow meld as much as they could. No, unfortunately, a couple of those mobs did leak through. But the thing to remember about Reaping that we kind of don't mention too often is that it has a massive aggro radius. We're talking 30-40 yards. So if they see you, if they pretty much catch a glimpse of you, they're going to come running. And that's what we saw with this Lost Soul here. It's an extra thing. We do see them actually getting hit by this frontal static slam ability. It's kind of weird that they get hit by that. It's a pretty telegraphed mechanic.
Yeah, I mean that, and I mean you're talking one thing. I'm looking at Abrakeydabra again. They didn't enter with flechettes. 2 stacks of poison out on everyone. No deaths, but Ashine getting really low again as he had the ice spritzer ticking on him. Barely able to get out of that 4-stack Grievous. Lot of issues over there as we finally get the sack pet there and everything he can to stay alive, helping out with some death strikes and stabilizes. 40K here, getting those foot bombs into the boss, making sure that you get that stacking 50% damage increase taken on the boss. Now, trick here really is to get those first 2 bombs in as quickly as possible, followed by waiting on the 3rd one just as long as you can so you can refresh the buff and get it up to 150% damage taken to maximize DPS efficiency. Sometimes, unfortunately, you are forced to kind of get all 3 in at once, depending on what combination of static shock is coming that will punt you back, or of course the coin absorb on the ground.
And of course, should you fail to kick any of those bombs into the boss, they will instead explode on your group, giving your entire group that 50% damage taken debuff, which together with the static shock AoE ability from the boss, you could get pretty low, and that's pretty scary in this Grievous environment.
Yeah, no, and Grievous can just snowball so easily in here, and it really makes the healer's life quite tough, especially when they're trying to divvy a lot of their healing onto that tank who's just pulling so much trash right now. Nonetheless, Pummeler finally pulled here by Abrakeydabra. We see the Bloodlust come out in conjunction with that first round of debuffs from the soccer bombs, the foot bombs really, and finally 30% here for 40K. Now, both teams pretty well off on trash, but again, we're going to talk about it a million times. By the end of the dungeon, 6 deaths